Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1: The Portrait That Never Aged. The envelope appeared on a dull Monday, slipped beneath Cleo Hartwell's apartment door like it knew she was running out of time. The paper was thick, pale ivory, the kind that resisted bending. Her address was pressed into it in a deep wine-colored ink that shimmered strangely when she tilted it toward the window, as if the letters didn't quite belong to the light. She didn't open it right away. Cleo turned it over once, then again. The weight alone told her this wasn't a bill or another polite rejection from a gallery. Her name, written in slow, deliberate handwriting, felt too intentional, too personal. Still, curiosity finally won and she broke the seal. The message inside was brief and unnervingly calm. A private restoration request, a single portrait, a manor outside Salem, 19th century, generous pay, no strict deadline. All that was required was her presence within the week. Her pulse picked up. The timing felt almost cruel in its perfection. A canceled exhibition, rent overdue, 3 voicemails from her landlord she hadn't yet dared to delete. Her bank balance had shrunk to a number she refused to say out loud. This letter didn't just offer work, it offered air, space, survival. By the time she reached the end, she was already nodding, already imagining the drive north, already convincing herself that luck hadn't abandoned her after all. The signature belonged to an estate manager, a single name, a Salem phone number. When Cleo called, a woman answered, not the man she expected, but someone else entirely. Her voice was smooth and unhurried, shaped by an accent Cleo couldn't quite place. "Miss Hartwell," the woman said, as though continuing a conversation already begun. "Yes, we were waiting for you." Her name was Beatrice. She explained that the owner was away, that she herself would oversee everything. The portrait, she said, was old, very old. It had been kept out of sight for years. Time had not been kind to it. Cleo reached for her notebook, instinct kicking in. What kind of damage are we talking about? There was a pause. Paper shifted softly on the other end of the line. "The surface is fractured," Beatrice replied. "The colors have deepened beyond their original tones, and the last person who worked on it did not finish." That caught Cleo's attention. Why not? Another pause, longer this time. "It's difficult to explain without seeing it," Beatrice said carefully. "The subject tends to leave an impression." Cleo frowned, curiosity tightening its grip. "Who is it?" "Evangeline Ashford," came the answer. "She lived at the estate in the late 1800s. She was important to the house." "What about the artist?" "Unknown," Beatrice said. "Local, most likely." Silence settled between them, thin and expectant. "There are stories," Beatrice added at last, her tone barely shifting. "About Mrs. Ashford, I mean, but those can wait." The line went quiet, and Cleo realized she was holding her breath. "I wouldn't want old rumors to influence your judgment," Beatrice said evenly. "Houses like this accumulate stories the way they collect dust. Most of it is imagination. Your concern is the canvas, nothing else." That was enough for Cleo. She confirmed her arrival for the following Monday. Beatrice outlined the route in careful detail, warning her about the final stretch of road and assuring her that every tool she might need had already been prepared. Before ending the call, she mentioned a private bedroom and open access to the manor's library, as if to sweeten the isolation Cleo hadn't yet considered. The drive north passed quickly at first, city streets giving way to thinner traffic and wider sky. By the time her navigation system guided her onto a narrow lane framed by massive oak trees, the world felt older somehow, quieter, heavier. Then the manor revealed itself all at once, emerging from the leaves like it had been waiting for her to notice. Greystone spread across the hillside in layers of dark wood and aging stone, its many roofs and porches folding into one another. The design was ornate to excess, every surface carved or trimmed, repainted so many times the details had softened with age. In the slanting afternoon sun, the house didn't look majestic. It looked exhausted, like something that had been standing watch for far too long. Cleo pulled in near the entrance, barely shutting off the engine before the front door swung open. The woman who stepped out matched the voice she remembered. Gray hair pinned back with precision, sensible clothes, a posture that spoke of long habit rather than formality. She extended her hand with calm assurance. "Miss Hartwell, welcome. I'm Beatrice Mora." Her grip was solid, her smile courteous, restrained. "I hope the drive treated you kindly. These roads can be unpredictable." "It was smooth," Cleo said, adjusting the strap of her bag. "The house is impressive. I understand why the portrait matters." For the briefest moment, something crossed Beatrice's face, too quick to name, gone before Cleo could be sure she'd seen it. "Yes," Beatrice replied. "Preserving the family's past has always been a priority. Come, I'll show you to your room first. The painting will wait." Inside, Greystone felt dense with history. Dark-paneled walls absorbed the light. Furniture sat heavy and deliberate, arranged as if no one dared disturb it. Gold-framed paintings lined the corridors in careful symmetry. Cleo slowed as they walked, her trained eye catching details, brushwork, varnish, the subtle repetition of identical frames. Nearly all of them were portraits. Men stared out stiffly from another century, collars high, expressions guarded. Women followed, their hair sculpted into elaborate shapes, their gazes unreadable. As Cleo studied them, a quiet unease crept in, not fear exactly, but the odd sensation of being examined in return. Their faces held a quiet certainty, every smile restrained, every gaze precise. The craftsmanship was undeniable, yet Cleo couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes followed her as she moved, as if the walls themselves were paying attention. "Were these done by artists from the area?" she asked, stopping in front of a painting that drew her in more than the rest. A young woman draped in a soft blue gown, her expression sharp with intelligence and something close to defiance. "Some of them," Beatrice replied, halting beside her. The Ashfords believed strongly in nurturing nearby talent. She nodded toward the portrait. "That is Adelaide Vance, remarkably talented from what records suggest. She passed away far too early." Cleo tilted her head. "She painted this." Beatrice's lips curved faintly. "No, she is the subject, but she was also an artist herself in a manner of speaking, both creator and creation." There was a subtle note of amusement in her voice. The family found her compelling. Cleo wasn't sure why that word unsettled her, but it did. Her room waited on the second floor, generous in size and heavy with old-world comfort. A tall bed anchored the space, its carved posts rising like sentinels. Wide windows overlooked rolling lawns that stretched into shadow. Beatrice excused herself after reminding Cleo of dinner at 7 and an early morning ahead. Left alone, Cleo drifted to the window. As daylight faded, shadows slid slowly across the grounds, thick and deliberate, as if the dark moved with intention. The light felt different here, dense, almost tactile. It stirred something restless in her hands, an ache she usually only felt when standing before a blank canvas. Dinner took place in a vast dining room built for gatherings long forgotten. A table meant for dozens held just 3 settings. Beatrice presided at one end. A quiet man named Harold sat stiffly nearby, his weathered hands folded when he wasn't eating. Across from Cleo sat Iris, younger than the others, attentive and watchful. The meal itself was excellent, the conversation polite. They spoke of the estate's age, of schedules, of the room where Cleo would begin her work. And yet, beneath every exchange, something hummed. The staff communicated in small looks, pauses heavy with meaning, as though entire conversations were passing just out of her reach. When dessert arrived, an apple tart warm and unexpectedly perfect, Cleo decided to press her luck. "Could you tell me about Mrs. Ashford?" she asked lightly. "The woman in the portrait I'll be restoring." The quiet that followed lingered a fraction too long. Harold froze mid-bite. Iris's eyes flicked toward Beatrice, then dropped to her plate. "What would you like to know?" Beatrice asked at last. "Anything that helps me understand the work," Cleo said. "Her life, why the portrait mattered, what role she played here." Beatrice folded her hands carefully before answering. "Evangeline arrived at Greystone in 1892, she said, choosing each word with care. "She was newly married, very young, educated abroad. Her husband, Cornelius, was significantly her senior." She paused, as if weighing how much to release. "The portrait was commissioned not long after her arrival," Beatrice continued, "to mark a transition, a beginning. The painting had been completed within the first year of their marriage, and not long after she vanished." Beatrice let the words settle before continuing. "There was an accident. During a storm, Cornelius fell from the cliffs behind the estate. He didn't survive. Evangeline was devastated. After the funeral, she left Greystone and was never seen here again." She smoothed an invisible crease in the tablecloth. "The portrait was placed in storage. The family chose silence." "But people didn't," Cleo said gently. "They never do," Beatrice replied without warmth. "Especially in places like this. Truth is rarely as compelling as rumor." The finality in her voice suggested the subject was over, yet Cleo noticed the brief exchange of glances between Beatrice and Iris. Quick, sharp, almost cautionary. That night sleep carried Cleo somewhere unfamiliar. She stood in a cavernous studio filled wall to wall with paintings. Every canvas showed the same woman, each image altered by the slightest shift in expression, so subtle it was unsettling. As Cleo moved, every pair of painted eyes followed. Somewhere nearby, a brush whispered against canvas. Back and forth, slow, relentless. She couldn't see the painter, only hear the sound, steady as a pulse. Drawn by it, she walked toward the noise. Just as she reached the point where the artist should have been, she woke. Morning light spilled across her room, thin and colorless. The morning room lay on the ground floor, its tall windows facing the rising sun. It had been transformed into a careful workspace, easels centered, lamps positioned with precision, a long table laid out with solvents, brushes, and tools arranged with almost ceremonial neatness. At the center stood the portrait, hidden beneath a pale cloth. Cleo approached, slower than she expected herself to be. A strange hesitation rooted her in place. Instinct told her to uncover it immediately, yet something urged restraint. The covered canvas seemed to command the room, pulling her focus. She became aware of the stillness, the way sunlight cut the floor into perfect lines, the silence outside so complete it felt deliberate. When she finally lifted the cloth, her breath faltered. Even damaged, the painting was remarkable. The hand behind it was confident, practiced, someone who understood both anatomy and emotion. The woman depicted was young, barely past 20. Her dark hair was intricately styled, her gown a deep, wine-colored red that glimmered faintly beneath layers of age and cracking varnish. But it was the face that held Cleo. The features were refined yet resolute. The eyes were large, dark, and unsettlingly alive, as if they carried knowledge meant to remain hidden. Her expression hovered in an uneasy balance, neither joy nor sorrow, but something suspended between. It was the expression of someone holding a private truth, knowledge just out of reach. The damage was more severe than Cleo had anticipated. Fine fractures webbed across the canvas, and the pigments had deepened into shadows so dense that portions of the background were nearly swallowed by black. And yet, the face remained astonishingly intact. Age had ravaged everything around it while sparing the features that mattered most, as if deterioration itself had chosen to look away. The task would be demanding, but it was within reach. Cleo spent the morning studying the piece from every angle, shifting lamps, adjusting filters, documenting each detail with careful notes and photographs. On the surface, the style aligned with the late 19th century, but beneath that familiarity lay techniques far ahead of their time. The nuanced way light softened the skin, the almost imperceptible transitions between highlight and shadow. This wasn't just technical proficiency, it was perception. The work of someone who truly understood how people are seen. The first disturbance came during lunch. Cleo had been cleaning a narrow section of background, her focus unbroken for hours. When she stepped back to evaluate her progress, something felt wrong. Not broken, changed. The woman's gaze seemed sharper now, more attentive. The lips hinted at motion, the suggestion of a smile forming where none had been before. Cleo frowned and pulled up her reference photos from earlier that day. She compared them carefully to the canvas in front of her. No difference. The camera saw nothing unusual. She exhaled slowly, grounding herself. This was familiar territory. Restorers experienced this all the time. After prolonged focus, the mind began to reinterpret what it saw. Subtle shifts appeared where none existed, a trick of perception, nothing more. And yet a different part of her mind, the part trained by years of study, couldn't help but marvel. If the effect was intentional, the craftsmanship was staggering. To paint eyes that responded to perspective, expressions that seemed to evolve with light and distance, required a psychological insight few artists ever reached. It was mastery of the rarest kind. The sensation didn't fade as the day wore on. Each time Cleo lifted her head, the woman felt closer, more present, as though awareness itself had been layered into the paint. By evening, Cleo realized she had shifted her position. She worked facing away from the easel now, catching reflections in the glass of a cabinet, glancing back when she thought she wasn't being observed. Even then, fear never fully took hold. What she felt beneath the unease was awe. Whatever the cause, the method behind it was nothing short of remarkable. That evening passed in a hush. At dinner, Beatrice inquired about the restoration with practiced courtesy, and Cleo responded with measured professionalism, describing the fractures in the canvas, the darkened varnish, the careful steps she planned to take. She avoided mentioning the unsettling sense that the painting had changed beneath her hands. Instead, she steered the conversation elsewhere. "You mentioned there's no record of the artist," Cleo said. "Nothing at all." "Nothing that remains," Beatrice answered. Household ledgers from that era were meticulous, yet there is no payment listed for a painter. It may have been someone within the family, or perhaps a guest with training. Cleo hesitated, then followed her instinct. What about Evangeline herself? Did she paint? Beatrice blinked, visibly caught off guard. I can't say for certain. Why? There's an intimacy in the technique, Cleo explained. The way the face is rendered compared to the rest of the composition. It feels familiar, almost personal. That's common in self-portraits. Iris, who had been quiet until then, looked up abruptly. You think she painted herself? It's a possibility, Cleo said. The emphasis on the face, the restraint elsewhere, and if she studied abroad, she may have learned formally. A silent exchange passed between Beatrice and Iris, brief, weighted. I suppose it cannot be ruled out, Beatrice said at last. Records from that time are fragmented. Sleep brought no rest. Cleo found herself once more in the morning room, but it was transformed. Light flooded the space, warm and vibrant. The air felt alive. The woman from the portrait stood before an easel, no longer trapped in paint, dressed in the same deep red gown. Her movements were confident, her brush gliding with certainty. When she looked up, her eyes were unmistakable. You understand, the woman said softly, her voice marked by a gentle, unfamiliar cadence. You see what they never did. Cleo tried to answer, but her throat refused to cooperate. The woman smiled, turning back to her work. Only then did Cleo notice the eyes again. She was reflected in them, but the image was wrong. Her reflection followed her movements with a faint delay, like an echo struggling to keep pace. She jolted awake, heart racing. Moonlight cut sharply through the darkness of her room, too bright, too precise. She rose and checked the clock. 3:00 a.m. As she passed the dresser, she caught her reflection in the mirror, and for the briefest instant, it lagged behind her motion, just as it had in the dream. Her dream, when she focused on the mirror, everything behaved as it should. Her reflection obeyed her movements. The moment passed, leaving behind only unease. By morning, that unease had sharpened. Cleo entered the morning room and stopped cold. The cloth was gone. She knew that she had covered the painting the night before. Yet there it stood, exposed to the pale sunlight pouring through the tall windows. The woman's dark eyes seemed fixed on her, following her path across the floor, and the expression, it had changed. There was an alertness now, a quiet anticipation, as though the painted figure had been waiting for her return. Cleo forced herself to work. She focused on the background, carefully lifting layers of aged varnish to uncover the colors beneath. The process was slow, methodical, almost soothing, but no amount of concentration could quiet the awareness creeping along her spine. Again and again, she glanced up, half expecting movement. Once, just once, she could have sworn the woman's chest rose, then fell, like a breath drawn and released. She told herself she was overtired. The truth shattered that excuse later in the afternoon. Cleo stepped back to evaluate her progress and froze. The woman's head was no longer facing forward. It had turned slightly to the left, her gaze angled toward the windows. Cleo's pulse thundered. She was certain, absolutely certain, that the portrait had been facing her that morning. She checked her photographs with trembling hands. Every image showed the same pose she now saw before her. Her brush slipped from her fingers. This wasn't a trick of perception. This wasn't imagination. This was change. She left the room and found Beatrice in the kitchen, quietly preparing tea. The painting, Cleo said, skipping any greeting. Has anyone else touched it? Beatrice looked up, her expression carefully blank. Touched it. It's different, Cleo insisted. The pose has changed. No one enters the morning room, Beatrice said evenly. You're the only one with access. I'm not imagining this, Cleo said, her voice unsteady. She's looking somewhere else. I saw her this morning. Beatrice set her teacup down with deliberate precision. Miss Hartwell, she said calmly, you've been working long hours. Deep focus can do strange things to the mind. Perhaps rest would be wise. This isn't exhaustion, Cleo replied. Something is happening, you know it is. Beatrice studied her in silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower. The morning room has always been peculiar, she said. The light, the way it falls. Some spaces affect perception more than others. Sound carries, Beatrice said quietly, pouring tea with careful movements. People sometimes notice unusual things when they spend time in the morning room. What kind of things? Cleo asked, wary. Nothing dangerous, Beatrice replied almost casually. Just awareness, the feeling that the room remembers. Remembers what? The past, I suppose, the people who lived here, the events that shaped this house. Her tone was light, as though discussing the weather. Old houses collect impressions the way they collect dust. Most of the time we don't notice, but under the right conditions, some of us do. You mean the house is haunted? Cleo pressed, skeptical. Beatrice smiled faintly, unshaken. I mean houses have memories, Miss Hartwell. Sometimes those memories surface, and sensitive people can perceive them. Cleo studied her. You knew something would happen. You knew there was something about the painting. I knew you were the right person for this restoration. Beatrice said smoothly, your skill isn't just technical. You have intuition, an understanding that sees beyond the surface. Cleo's next question caught the room in a sudden stillness. What happened to the previous restorer? Beatrice's face remained calm, but her eyes flickered. They completed their work and left, as you will when the time comes. I want to see security footage from the morning room, Cleo said firmly. There isn't any, Beatrice replied. The room isn't monitored. Privacy is essential. Artistic work requires solitude. Cleo felt a cold knot tighten in her chest. Then I want to speak to Mr. Ashford. He's abroad, Beatrice said evenly. Unavailable for several weeks. Then I want to leave. You may leave at any time, Beatrice said, but I think you'll find the work compelling. Artists rarely abandon projects that matter. That night, Cleo tried to convince herself she would leave. She folded clothes into her suitcase, arranged her belongings, and told herself she would be gone by morning. But deep down, she knew it was a lie. The portrait was pulling her, insistent and impossible to ignore. She needed to understand it. She needed to finish what had begun. Sleep carried her again, and this time she held the brush. She stood before a canvas of impossible light. Every color burned with intensity. Burgundy that throbbed like blood, black that devoured shadows, skin tones that glowed warm enough to touch. With each stroke, her consciousness seemed to flow into the painting itself, merging with the woman she had been restoring, becoming part of the very image she sought to understand. When she awoke, her fingers were stained with colors that felt impossibly real, lingering like a promise she could not yet comprehend. Paint. Morning brought no comfort. When Cleo entered the room, the portrait had shifted again. The woman now faced the doorway directly, positioned as if she were waiting for anyone who dared step inside. Her expression was no longer subtle. Intelligence shone openly in those dark eyes, sharp and unsettling. and beneath it something else flickered, an urgency that felt like a warning or a request for help. Cleo moved closer, forgetting her tools entirely. At this distance, the details were impossible. Skin rendered with depth and softness no 19th century method should have achieved. Individual lashes casting delicate shadows. Highlights that seemed to slide across the surface as she shifted her weight. And then she felt it, a faint heat rising from the canvas like warmth from living flesh. Her voice came out as a breath. "What do you want from me?" The painted mouth curved ever so slightly, just enough to suggest an answer. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Cleo worked with frantic focus, driven by a pressure she couldn't name. Layers fell away beneath her careful hands, revealing color that burned with vitality. The deep red of the dress bloomed into richness. The skin tones warmed, lifelike and vivid, and with every section restored, the presence in the room intensified. By afternoon, she no longer doubted it. The woman was watching her. Those eyes followed her movements. When Cleo crossed the room, the gaze tracked her. Once, only once, she was certain she saw the rise and fall of a breath beneath the painted bodice. Later, she heard something else, a sound just below hearing, a whisper pressed thin by distance, unmistakably real. The discovery came during her evening break. Under magnification, Cleo examined the pigment layers, checking for instability. At first, everything appeared consistent, minerals and compounds common to the era. Then she noticed what didn't belong. Certain particles caught the light wrong. One metallic substance carried a faint green hue. Another wasn't pigment at all, more like residue. Ash perhaps, but with a fibrous quality that made her stomach tighten. She extracted the smallest possible sample and increased the magnification. The metal was familiar, too familiar. A preservative compound once used freely, long before its danger was understood. Arsenic. Her pulse spiked as she examined the other material more closely. The ash wasn't wood. Its texture was too fine, too complex. Traces suggested calcium, keratin, fragments that looked disturbingly like hair or fabric fused by heat. The truth struck her with brutal clarity. This wasn't just paint. It was remains. Human remains. Cleo staggered back, her elbow clipping the work table. Glass clattered, tools scattered across the floor. She barely noticed. The portrait stared back at her, eyes bright, alive with recognition. And for the first time, the expression was unmistakable. It was victory. Even in her horror, part of Cleo's mind refused to stop analyzing. This is how she did it, she thought, a mix of disgust and admiration coiling in her chest. This is how she made the eyes breathe, made the gaze so impossibly alive. The technique was monstrous and brilliant. By weaving human essence into the pigments, the artist had created life itself on canvas. Presence, awareness, a connection that went beyond paint, beyond skill. It was the ultimate union of subject and artwork. The kind of breakthrough that artists fantasize about, the kind they never achieve. And yet, the thought that she could feel awe in the face of such horror made Cleo recoil inwardly. What kind of person admires this? What kind of person is complicit in it, simply by seeing it? "Dear God," she whispered, "what are you?" The painted lips moved. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible but enough. And then she heard it, not with her ears but in the hollow of the room, a voice like wind threading through autumn leaves. "Free me." Sleep didn't come that night. Cleo sat at her window, staring at the sprawling grounds below, her mind racing. The paint contained human ash. Whose? Why? The questions were horrifying, but they explained the portrait's unnatural qualities. If the woman's remains were in the pigment, she was literally a part of the painting. And that raised even darker possibilities. Had she been murdered, cremated specifically to become pigment? Was the portrait a memorial or a prison? Pieces of the story slotted together in her mind. Evangeline Ashford, the young bride who vanished after her husband's death. The portrait completed in their first year of marriage. The hushed warnings and gossip Beatrice had so carefully dismissed. What if it wasn't gossip? What if Evangeline had killed her husband, and someone had punished her by making her a permanent part of the very work meant to immortalize her? A shiver ran down Cleo's spine, but it was accompanied by something else: purpose. If the woman had been trapped in the painting, then this restoration was no longer mere preservation. It was liberation, justice. She had to finish it. Morning arrived, crisp and quiet. Cleo returned to the morning room, her resolve sharpened into focus. The portrait seemed to sense it. The woman's eyes were alert, expectant, almost eager, tracking her every step. Cleo set to work with renewed precision, her hands steady and swift. Layer by layer, she stripped away the aged, darkened varnish, revealing the original colors in all their astonishing brilliance. The dress glimmered in deep, lifelike burgundy. The skin radiated warmth. Every detail, every stroke, every shaft breathed again under her care. The portrait was extraordinary, not merely a painting, but a presence, alive and waiting, and Cleo felt the weight of its gaze as she brought it back to life. Technically, the restoration was flawless, but emotionally, the portrait spoke of more than skill. The woman's face radiated intelligence, strength, and a sorrow so profound it seemed to echo through the room. It was the face of someone wronged, someone who had endured suffering beyond what words could capture. As the hours passed, Cleo felt subtle changes in herself. Her movements became fluid, precise, instinctive. Each brushstroke brought a clarity she had never known, an understanding of the painting's structure that went beyond technique. And with it came something deeper, a strange communion, as if her mind were brushing against the consciousness of the woman she had restored. By evening, the work was nearly complete. The portrait glowed, vibrant and full of life. Every fold of the dress shimmered, every shadow and highlight in the face radiated realism. She stepped back, heart swelling with triumph, and froze. The face was gone. Where once the dark, knowing eyes had followed her, there was nothing but the empty shape of the burgundy dress, sagging as if its occupant had simply vanished. The intensity, the presence, all of it gone. Cleo spun around, searching the room. The morning room was as still and silent as it had ever been, save for the strange, growing awareness that seemed to pulse in the space around her. "Evangeline," she whispered, voice trembling. The reply was not sound, but movement, something flickering in the corner of her eye. She turned sharply. Only her own reflection stared back at her in the dark window panes, except it wasn't right. The image lagged behind her motions, delayed, imperfect, just as it had in her dreams. Understanding bloomed slowly, like dawn cutting through darkness. The restoration hadn't freed Evangeline. It had allowed her to cross into the world outside the canvas. But every prison leaves a seat to fill. Every escape leaves a vacancy. Cleo's chest tightened as realization sank in. She was becoming the portrait's new inhabitant. Her thoughts, her awareness, were flowing into the canvas even as Evangeline had flowed out. She tried to step back, but her feet were leaden, rooted. The room shifted, the air thickening. colors blending into the brushwork of her own impending transformation. The morning light rippled across the walls as if painted itself, and she felt herself flattening, losing depth, blending into the two-dimensional world of the portrait. "No," she whispered, but the sound was distant, echoing as if from inside a frame. The transformation was gentle, inexorable. Her body softened into strokes of color, her consciousness slowing to match the eternal stillness of the portrait. She became paint. She became canvas. And in that quiet, stretching forever, she understood what it meant to be immortalized, not in life, but in art. But just before her consciousness fully dissolved into paint and silence, she heard footsteps, measured, unhurried. They echoed down the hallway, like a verdict being delivered. Beatrice appeared in the doorway first, her posture composed, her expression calm. Iris followed, hands folded neatly, and behind her came Harold, already studying the room with professional detachment. They stopped before the portrait. Their faces held satisfaction, and something close to pity. "She did beautiful work," Iris said softly, tilting her head. "Look how lifelike it is." "Yes," Beatrice replied. "Evangeline chose well this time. This one has real talent." Cleo tried to scream, tried to beg, tried to force even the smallest flicker of movement into her painted form. But she was no longer flesh or breath or voice. She was pigment and canvas, frozen forever in the instant of her terrible realization. She could only watch. The three of them leaned closer, examining her with the calm interest of curators. "The eyes are particularly good," Harold observed. "Very expressive, almost like she's trying to tell us something." "They always do," Beatrice said lightly. "The talented ones put so much of themselves into their work." "What shall we do with the original canvas?" Iris asked, gesturing toward what had once been Evangeline's portrait, now nothing more than a burgundy dress hanging emptily within its frame. "Store it with the others," Beatrice replied. "We'll need it again eventually." As they turned to leave, Beatrice paused. She stepped closer and looked directly into Cleo's painted eyes. "Don't worry, dear," she said gently. "Your work will be appreciated. This family has always valued artistic talent." The door closed. Silence returned, and with it the truth. Greystone Manor was not merely a house. It was a trap, carefully maintained, patiently fed. A place designed to lure artists with promises of importance and legacy, only to harvest their devotion and imprison it forever in oil and canvas. The portraits lining the corridors were not decorations. They were cells. Each one held a mind that had loved their craft too deeply, trusted too completely, and now Cleo was among them. Days passed, or weeks. Time lost all meaning inside the frame. She watched the morning room endlessly through eyes that could never close. Sunlight rose and fell across the floor she could never step upon. Shadows lengthened. Lamps were lit, extinguished, again and again. Sometimes staff members entered to dust the shelves or rearrange the furniture. Each time, Cleo tried desperately to communicate, to will a crack, a tremor, anything. But paint cannot speak. Portraits cannot move. During one such cleaning, as Iris worked nearby, something shifted. Cleo felt it before she understood it. Other presences. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. She sensed them the way one senses pressure before a storm. Mind stretched thin across canvas, aware yet trapped. Adelaide Vance, whose portrait hung in the hallway. Others whose names she did not know, whose faces she had never seen, but whose despair pressed against her own. They were watching, waiting, hopping, Together, they endured the stillness, bound by silence, praying that someday someone would see past the beauty on the walls and understand the price that had been paid to put it there. But that warning would never come, not from her, not in any way she could control. Yet something pulsed in Cleo's painted chest, a frantic, impossible heartbeat of anticipation. The staff were preparing again. She could hear the ritual, sweeping, polishing, arranging the morning room, laying out clean restoration supplies. Another artist was coming to Greystone Manor. Her painted form trembled in silent emotion. Sympathy for the new victim about to be drawn in. Fear for the trap that would claim them. But beneath it all, a fragile spark of hope. If only she could reach them, warn them, somehow break the cycle, maybe, just maybe, they could escape together. Or maybe they would simply join the ranks of the trapped, another consciousness suspended behind the paint. Morning came. Cleo watched through the paneled windows as a car wound up the long oak-lined drive. A young man stepped out, hauling the familiar black equipment case that marked him as a professional. Every movement radiated eagerness, excitement, the same raw ambition she had felt before arriving here. Beatrice appeared, immaculate and controlled, greeting him with the calm efficiency that had once lulled Cleo into a false sense of security. Through the walls, Cleo heard the ritual unfold. The welcome, the tour, the careful explanation of the work to come. And then inevitably, the soft, deliberate footsteps in the hallway, drawing closer to the morning room. The door opened. David entered, a young man in his mid-20s with that rare intensity of focus reserved for those who truly live for their craft. Beatrice followed just behind as always. He paused, studying the portrait, eyes scanning every stroke, every shadow with meticulous attention. "Extraordinary work," he murmured, leaning closer. "The technique, it's remarkably sophisticated. And the expression, it's almost as if she's trying to speak." "Yes," Beatrice said, almost fondly. "Many visitors comment on that. The artist was skilled, very skilled. Records are unclear, but clearly someone of exceptional talent." David nodded, unpacking his brushes and solvents, completely unaware of the danger lurking in the pigment. Cleo's painted hands reached out in vain. She wanted to scream, to gesture, to shake him awake to the truth, but she was frozen, trapped in canvas and color. All she could do was watch. He began to work, careful, deliberate strokes, as she had once done, unaware that each motion drew him closer to the same fate she had suffered. The cycle was beginning again. And yet there was something different. David didn't just restore, he studied. He analyzed. Every movement was intentional, every angle considered, every brushstroke a question asked of the portrait. His technique went beyond mere restoration. It was a careful, scientific dissection of the painting's life, as if he were searching for more than preservation, searching for understanding. Cleo could only watch, a mix of dread and fascination coursing through her trapped consciousness. The trap was resetting, the cycle was repeating, and somewhere, deep in the layers of paint and shadow, hope stirred that maybe, just maybe, this one would see it before it was too late. And then, just as it had happened to her, David found it. "These pigments," he said suddenly, straightening from the magnifying glass, his voice no longer calm. "They're not standard. There's something else mixed into the paint." Cleo felt it before she saw it. The subtle shift in the room, the tightening of the air. Beatrice, standing in the doorway, went still. "Organic compounds," David continued, frowning. "Ash, traces of metal. This paint was made with unusual materials. Many old paintings contain unexpected substances," Beatrice replied carefully, her tone measured, rehearsed. Artists of that era often experimented. Not like this. David stepped back, color draining from his face. This isn't experimentation. It's deliberate. Someone mixed human remains into this paint. Silence collapsed over the room, thick and dangerous. Cleo could feel it pressing in the moment when truth shattered the illusion. Beatrice's pleasant expression faltered, just for an instant. "I think you should continue your work, Mr. Patterson," she said at last. "Old paintings often contain mysteries. It's best not to dwell on them." But David was already retreating, his tools forgotten. "I need to call the police. This is evidence of a crime." "I'm afraid that won't be possible." The voice came from behind him. Harold stood in the doorway now, Iris beside him. Together they blocked the exit. Their smiles were gone. "What is this place?" David demanded. "A sanctuary," Beatrice replied smoothly. "A place where art is preserved, where artists can become truly immortal." "You're insane." "Are we?" Beatrice gestured toward the walls. "Look at the work here, the depth, the technique, the emotion. Do you believe ordinary artists created these, or artists who transcended the limits of mortal flesh?" David's gaze swept the room, then stopped on Cleo's portrait. For a brief, terrible moment, their eyes met. She saw understanding bloom in his expression, horror, recognition. "You're trapped," he whispered. "All of you, these aren't paintings, they're prisons." "They're homes," Beatrice corrected softly. "Places where vision endures beyond time, beyond death." "I won't let you do this to me." "You don't have a choice, Mr. Patterson. The process has already begun. You've breathed the air of Greystone, absorbed its essence. Soon, leaving won't even be possible." David turned and ran. Harold was faster. Massive hands clamped down on David's shoulders, pinning him in place despite his struggle. "Don't fight it," Iris said gently, almost kindly. "It's easier if you don't resist." From her silent prison, Cleo watched helplessly as the truth she had prayed someone would see finally destroyed the last chance of escape. Harold lunged forward, but David was faster now, fueled by sheer desperation and understanding. His brush moved in a blur, each stroke deliberate, precise, and alive with purpose. Cleo felt it, the tug, the pull of her own consciousness responding to his efforts. The canvas rippled under the touch of fresh paint, the old pigments quivering as if startled. "You can do it," she wanted to shout, but her voice was trapped in layers of oil and pigment. Still, her will surged and the connection deepened. The faint shift she had started, her painted fingers flexing, spread across the portrait, subtle at first, then more defined, until the figure of Cleo in paint seemed almost ready to step out of the frame. Beatrice's eyes widened, shock breaking the carefully maintained mask. "Impossible," she whispered, as the laws she had trusted so long began to unravel before her. David's movements were frantic now, but precise, each brushstroke undoing decades of entrapment. He was painting a bridge, a corridor through which Cleo's essence could flow back into her own body. The ash, the arsenic, the organic pigments, they weren't just preservation, they were conduits, and he was learning to reverse the current. A soft, almost musical vibration ran through the portrait. Cleo's painted skin shimmered, warm and alive, no longer static. Her eyes, the eyes that had haunted David, that had haunted her for days, flickered with awareness. She was moving. Slowly, impossibly, her painted arms shifted, pressing against the invisible barrier of the canvas. The burgundy dress shimmered like liquid under the morning light of the real room, and for a heartbeat, the boundary between painted and living seemed to dissolve entirely. Almost there, David muttered, sweat glistening on his brow. Each brushstroke was a heartbeat, each smear of color a pulse of life. Cleo felt the sensation of breath in her lungs, warmth in her limbs, sensation returning as if she had been asleep for centuries. Beatrice and Harold stepped forward, but the air between them thickened, unyielding. The house itself seemed to resist their intervention, but the power of two conscious wills, one trapped, one desperate to free her, proved stronger. And then, with a final stroke, a final surge of will, Cleo's painted form began to pull free. The canvas rippled like water breaking, and with a gasp that tore through the silent morning room, her body collapsed into reality, flesh and blood replacing pigment and oil. David stumbled back, breathless, staring at the woman who had returned. Cleo's eyes, dark and aware, met his with gratitude, relief, and unspoken warning. The room was still, the portrait now empty, but no longer ominous. "You did it," she whispered, voice trembling. "You brought me back." David sank to the floor, shaking, staring at the ruined pigments, now inert, harmless. The power that had trapped so many before her was broken, at least for now. But Cleo knew deep in her bones that Greystone Manor still held secrets, still hungered for artists. And as she stood, stretching her limbs, truly alive again, she realized freedom was a gift, and one that would need defending. Cleo blinked, catching her breath, and for a moment she could feel that strange, suspended calm, the artistic serenity that the painted world had offered. It had been cruel, yes, but also intoxicating. Every brushstroke, every nuance of light and shadow had been hers to explore, unhurried, unjudged. And now, as the canvas crumbled under David's hands and the portraits across the manor began to stir, that beauty and terror collided. "Cleo," David's voice was hoarse, charged with urgency, as he continued to tear through layers of centuries-old paint. "We have to move fast. The others, they're waiting." Through the walls, a ripple of movement reached her, faint at first, then stronger. Shadows lifted from frames across the hallways. Adelaide Vance, eyes wide with fear and relief, emerged from the gilded confines of her portrait, followed by dozens of others, each one stepping cautiously into reality, fragile at first, then more solid with every heartbeat. The air was alive with energy, the house groaning as if waking from a long, unnatural slumber. Beatrice's face contorted with disbelief, rage, and something that almost looked like sorrow. "You, how can this?" David didn't stop. "It's over. Your control ends here." Each strike of his knife against the cursed paint shattered a bond, unraveling decades of manipulation, cruelty, and trapped brilliance. The arsenic, the ash, the warped alchemy that had held these artists hostage. It was dissolving, freeing consciousness with each scraped layer. Cleo felt herself fully returned, her limbs warm and real. Yet every step she took carried the memory of that otherworldly space. She looked at the freed artists, at their astonished, trembling faces, and realized the true scope of the horror they'd endured, and the miracle of their escape. For a heartbeat, she felt a pang of grief for what had been lost, the stolen years, the creativity consumed, the lives twisted. But then she let it go. The restored freedom was worth the weight of grief. And in that instant, the manor seemed to react, a low rumble shaking the walls, the paintings, the very air, as if acknowledging the end of its dominion. The staff, Beatrice, Harold, Iris, stood frozen, powerless now against the tide they had long nurtured. The legacy of abuse, the centuries-long collection, collapsed under the will of those who had once been imprisoned. Cleo took David's hand firmly, guiding him toward the exit. "We leave," she said, voice steady, eyes burning with purpose. "No one else gets trapped, ever again." As they reached the front doors, Sunlight spilled across the grounds, breaking through the oppressive shadows that had cloaked the manor for generations. The freed artists stepped behind them, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence, reclaiming their lives. And for the first time, Greystone Manor felt like a place emptied of its malevolent weight, a house no longer hungry, a structure stripped of its dark magic. Cleo paused, looking back one last time at the sprawling, ornate mansion. It had been a trap, a prison, a masterwork of cruelty, but now it was simply walls and wood, paint and stone. And the people who had been stolen within its frames were finally alive. For the first time in decades, the silence of Greystone was ordinary, real, free. It's imprisonment, Cleo said, her voice cutting through the hypnotic weight of Beatrice's words. They aren't free. They're trapped. Eternal, yes, but empty. Their lives stolen, their visions enslaved. That isn't art, it's a cage. Beatrice's smile faltered, the illusion of calm slipping as her painted features flickered like unstable pigment. You don't understand, she whispered, almost pleading, her voice a brittle echo of the former warmth she'd projected. We preserve greatness. We give them immortality. David gritted his teeth, shaking off the seductive pull of the canvases around him. Immortality at the cost of their will isn't immortality. It's murder, and we're not letting you do it to anyone else. Cleo nodded, determination coiling in her chest. We finished this restoration not to destroy, but to free them. Every brushstroke, every scrape of varnish. It's liberation, not preservation. The morning room seemed to resist, the paint on the walls quivering, the air thick with tension. The portraits shifted, the trapped artists reacting to the intrusions on their prisoned reality, some almost reaching out from their frames, their expressions pleading for release. The house groaned, an old, living thing that had never been meant to lose control. But Cleo and David pressed on. Layer by layer, they dismantled the alchemy of paint and ash, unraveling the hold of the arsenic and the organic compounds. With each freed consciousness, the room lightened, the oppressive aura easing, and the painted figures that had tempted them with eternity now seemed fragile, desperate, hungry for life they'd been denied. Beatrice's voice rose in despair, the hypnotic quality cracking. You can't undo it. You don't know what you've started. Yes, we do, Cleo said, steady now, unflinching. We know exactly what we're starting, the end of your collection, and the return of those who were stolen. One by one, the artists emerged from their frames, blinking in the real sunlight for the first time in decades, bodies and minds restored, faces alive with a mix of awe and disbelief. The room, once a sanctuary of frozen talent, had become a chamber of rebirth. Cleo stepped back, heart pounding, as the last layer of paint fell away from the central portrait. The burgundy dress hung empty now, a reminder of what had been, but also of what had been reclaimed. The temptation of perfection and eternal art dissolved, leaving only freedom. Beatrice, Harold, and Iris faded into the shadows of the room, powerless against the will of those they had tried to enslave. And for the first time, the morning room was silent, not oppressive, not haunted, but alive with potential, with the raw, chaotic beauty of life returned to its rightful owners. Cleo exhaled, brushing sweat and fear from her brow, and looked around at the freed artists. We're done, she said softly. All of you go, live, create, be human again. And for the first time in over a century, Greystone Manor felt empty in the way it should. Still grand, still historic, but no longer hungry, no longer a trap. The echoes of artistry remained, but the souls behind them were free. The illusion. The walls rippled one last time, colors bleeding into one another as if the house itself were being washed clean. Then the light shattered, glass, canvas, history, collapsing inward with a sound like 1,000 frames breaking at once. Greystone Manor did not burn or explode. It simply unmade itself, pigment dissolving back into stone, wood, and dust. They stood outside in the cold morning air as the last echoes faded. Where the manor had been was only an empty rise of land, damp earth, and the faint smell of old oil paint carried away by the wind. No ruins, no foundations, as if it had never existed. One by one, the freed artists gathered themselves. Some wept, some laughed softly in disbelief. Others simply stood in silence, feeling time return to their bodies, aching joints, racing hearts, the miracle of breath. Adelaide closed her eyes and tilted her face to the sun. "I can feel it," she whispered. "Time, I can feel it again." David looked at Cleo, really looked at her as if confirming she was solid, real. "You could have stayed," he said quietly. "You almost did." Cleo nodded. "Part of me wanted to. That was the most frightening thing." She flexed her fingers, watching them move in perfect sync, no delay, no lag. But art that costs your soul isn't art. It's a prison with pretty walls. Sirens sounded in the distance, police, fire crews, officials responding to a place that would never be found. By the time they arrived, there would be nothing to investigate. No bodies, no paintings, no evidence that Greystone Manor had ever stood there at all. In the weeks that followed, the world quietly adjusted. Missing persons reports resolved themselves in impossible ways. Elderly artists reappeared, claiming isolation, lost years, false memories. Younger ones struggled to explain where they'd been, eventually learning not to try. Some returned to art. Some never touched a brush again. All of them carried the same haunted knowledge. Cleo returned to her work, but she chose her projects carefully now. No private estates, no sealed collections, no houses that felt like they were watching her. She painted sometimes, slowly, cautiously, always stopping before the work began to feel too alive. Occasionally she dreamed of the morning room. Dust motes in golden light, the hush of perfect stillness. But the dreams no longer pulled at her. They faded with the dawn. Art, she had learned, should reflect life, not replace it. And somewhere in galleries and studios around the world, paintings hung quietly on walls, beautiful, inert, harmless, as they should be. Illusion, the vast grounds, the ornate halls, the endless portraits, none of it had ever been real in the way Cleo once believed. Greystone Manor had been a mechanism, a beautifully engineered snare sustained by stolen imagination and imprisoned minds. They stepped onto a narrow country road, cracked asphalt cool beneath their feet. The air smelled of wet grass and early morning dew. In the distance, the lights of Salem glowed, ordinary, imperfect, alive. They were free. As they walked, Cleo slowed. In the dusty window of an abandoned farmhouse, she caught her reflection. It moved perfectly with her. No delay, no distortion. Everything was normal. Except the eyes. They still carried the depth of oil and shadow, the quiet weight of having existed between canvas and flesh. Eyes that had seen eternity framed in wood and varnish. She turned away. "Will it fade?" David asked softly, having noticed. "I don't know," Cleo said, "but I don't think it's meant to." They were changed, all of them. They had seen what creation became when twisted by obsession, when art was used not to express life but to cage it. "We understand now," Adelaide said. "The responsibility." Another artist nodded, a man whose hands still trembled with a century of stolen time. We can make something better, something that celebrates being alive. As the sun crept over the horizon, Cleo felt it, true inspiration. Not hunger, not compulsion, just the quiet desire to create freely. Behind them, Greystone Manor was gone. No ruins, no ashes, just an empty field dissolving into mist, as though the house had never been allowed to exist in the first place. The collection was destroyed. The cycle was broken. Yet if someone had looked closely at the farmhouse windows as the artists walked away, they might have noticed something strange. The reflections moved perfectly in sync, but there was a richness to them, a depth, as if a trace of pigment still lived beneath the skin. They had escaped the canvas, but the canvas had not entirely let them go. It arrived without warning on a gray October morning, the kind where the air feels thin and unfinished. Story 2, Legacy of the Cursed Cane. The package was left at the door just after dawn. Wrapped in dark, oil-soaked cloth, it carried a smell that made Dr. Nathaniel Crane pause before touching it. Sharp, antiseptic, layered with something faintly sweet and unsettling, like a memory he couldn't quite reach. The courier didn't linger. He pressed the bundle into Nathaniel's hands as if it burned, muttered something about an old estate, and hurried back down the steps. When Nathaniel asked a question, he wasn't sure which one. The man didn't turn around. His footsteps were too fast, too desperate, as the truck vanished down the street. Nathaniel stood there longer than necessary, the weight of the package sinking into his palms. It felt wrong somehow, too warm, as if it had been waiting. Inside, life tried to assert itself. Mail piled on the table, utility bills, a journal he no longer had the stamina to read cover to cover, a letter from his son, polite and distant. These were the artifacts of a life narrowed by pain, of a surgeon whose hands had betrayed him 5 years earlier, ending a career built on precision and trust. Still, the package refused to be ignored. He brewed coffee, skimmed the news, replied to emails about a consulting role he knew he would decline. And all the while, his eyes returned to the wrapped object, sitting patiently in the hallway like an accusation. By mid-morning, resistance gave way to curiosity. In his study, where tall windows filtered pale autumn light across shelves of aging medical texts, Nathaniel worked the knotted cord free with fingers stiffened by arthritis. The cloth fell away inch by inch, releasing that same strange scent, clean, clinical, and faintly intimate. A walking cane emerged. The wood was walnut, darkened to a color that reminded him uncomfortably of dried blood. It had been polished to a depth that didn't shine so much as drink in the light. The handle was silver, cool to the touch, carved with elaborate spirals that tightened the longer he looked. Then he noticed the markings. They weren't decorative. They were names. Dozens of them etched so finely they seemed almost impossible, each letter deliberate, careful, reverent. His breath slowed as he traced them with his thumb. At the base of the handle, larger and unmistakable, was an inscription. Property of Dr. Silas Crane, 1932. His grandfather, the man who had raised him after the epidemic took his parents, the surgeon who worked through the worst years of scarcity in a coastal town steeped in old histories and quiet superstition. Salem. Nathaniel hadn't thought about Silas in years, not consciously. Yet suddenly memories pressed in with surgical clarity, the sharp smell of disinfectant, the creak of floorboards in the clinic, the way Silas's voice never rose, even in emergencies. The cane felt heavier now. Why would it be sent to him? Why now? And why had it been stored for decades, waiting for a moment that no one had bothered to explain? Nathaniel set it beside his desk, telling himself it was nothing more than an heirloom, a relic from a harder time. But as he turned away, he felt it, an awareness, subtle but undeniable. The sense that something old had finally found its way home. After hanging up, Nathaniel returned to the living room and stood for a long time beneath the dim lamp, the house settling around him with its familiar night sounds. Pipes ticked softly in the walls. Somewhere the refrigerator hummed. He rested both hands on the cane and felt again that subtle warmth, steady and deliberate, like a pulse counting time. Only then did he notice how quiet his body felt. Not just the absence of pain, something deeper. His breath seemed too even, his heartbeat oddly restrained, as if some internal metronome had been adjusted without his consent. He pressed his fingers to his wrist. The rhythm was there, strong and regular, but it did not quite feel like it belonged to him. The thought unsettled him more than the years of aching ever had. That night, sleep came quickly but not peacefully. He dreamed of corridors, long tiled hallways washed in yellowed light. The air smelled of antiseptic and old metal. Somewhere nearby, instruments clinked together, the sound precise and careful, as though someone were preparing for work that demanded absolute focus. He tried to turn to see who was there, but his body would not respond. His chest tightened, breath turning shallow and unfamiliar, and for a terrible moment he understood that this was the sensation he had felt earlier. This was what had been left behind. When he woke just before dawn, his heart was racing, his sheets damp with sweat. The pain did not return. If anything, he felt lighter than ever. But the cane, resting against the nightstand, had cooled at last, its silver handle dull in the gray morning light. Over breakfast, Nathaniel found himself thinking about his grandfather with a clarity that surprised him. Not the stories told at family gatherings, the kindly old man with careful manners and a firm handshake, but the things that had gone unsaid. The locked study, the journals no one was allowed to read, the way his grandfather's colleagues had spoken about him in lowered voices, with respect edged by something else. Caution, perhaps, or fear. Nathaniel had always assumed those details were relics of a different era, the eccentricities of a man shaped by harsher times. Now, holding the cane again, he wondered if they had been warnings. By midday, the warmth had returned. It crept into his palm slowly, almost politely, and with it came that faint, borrowed pressure in his chest. He leaned against the counter, waiting for it to pass, and told himself, sternly, that relief sometimes came with sensations the body needed time to interpret. He had spent his life trusting physiology, trusting cause and effect. Miracles were simply mechanisms not yet understood. Still, when he caught his reflection in the kitchen window, he hesitated. For just a second, his expression looked unfamiliar, not younger, not healthier, simply different, as if someone else were considering the world through his eyes, weighing it carefully, deciding what might be taken next. The moment passed. The reflection returned to normal. Nathaniel exhaled and tightened his grip on the cane. Whatever this was, he told himself, it had given him back his life. And for now, that was enough. Unmistakably human. It lingered faintly, like a memory the senses refused to release. Nathaniel lifted his hands to his face again, inhaled cautiously, then dropped them as a quiet chill settled into his chest. He had known that smell once before, long ago, during his residency, on nights when the hospital corridors were too still and the work too intimate. It was the scent of the body opened and closed again, of things disturbed beneath the surface. He forced himself back into his chair and opened his notebook, determined to impose order on the morning. Dates, observations, symptoms. It was what he had always done when faced with the unknown. He wrote about the dirt, the warmth of the cane, the missing hours. He did not write about the sense of purpose he had felt upon waking, the strange certainty that whatever his body had done, it had done so with intent. By noon, the unease had dulled, worn down by routine and reason. Sleepwalking, he told himself. Stress, combined with years of chronic pain, finally released. The mind, unburdened, had wandered. There were studies, rare but documented, of complex motor behavior during sleep. Digging, however, that was harder to justify. He avoided the window that looked out onto the backyard. In the afternoon, he returned to the cane. Turning it slowly, he noticed that the carvings were not random along the shaft. They spiraled downward, growing denser near the base. The earliest dates were closest to the handle. The most recent entries, those etched deepest with the surest hand, were near the tip. 1939 was the last year recorded. Nathaniel's throat tightened. His grandfather had lived another 15 years after that. Whatever work the cane represented, it had ended abruptly. Not naturally, he suspected, but deliberately. That evening, Mitchell called again. Just checking in, his son said, his voice warm but cautious. Nathaniel reassured him, perhaps too quickly, that everything was fine. He did not mention the dirt or the broken nails. Some things, he felt instinctively, should remain within the family, or perhaps within the blood. When night came, he hesitated before setting the cane beside the bed. A lifetime of habit won out. He placed it carefully against the nightstand, within reach, and lay down. Sleep took him almost at once. This time, the dream was clearer. He was walking along a narrow path bordered by trees stripped bare, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground beneath his feet was soft, yielding. Ahead of him, a light burned low and steady. He knew, without knowing how, that he was not alone. Others were there, just beyond sight, breathing shallowly, waiting. When he knelt, his hands moved with practiced ease. He woke screaming. The room was dark, the air cold. His heart hammered in his chest, painfully, violently, as if making up for something it had lost. For one terrible second, the old ache flared in his back, and then vanished as his fingers closed around the cane. The relief was immediate, so was the warmth. Nathaniel lay there, staring at the ceiling, breath slowly evening out. Outside, dawn was still hours away. He did not sleep again. By morning, he understood the truth he had been avoiding. The cane did not heal. It transferred. And whatever burden it removed from him was not simply disappearing. It was being carried somewhere else by someone else, or perhaps by him, just not the part of him that woke with the sun. With fresh soil and something darker, sticky beneath the dirt, his fingers trembled as he lifted his hand toward his face. And the smell confirmed what his mind resisted. Not decay, not rot, this was new, recently disturbed. A shallow pit yawned at his feet. The earth there had been clawed open with desperate precision, the kind that came from strength driven by urgency rather than panic. A headstone nearby lay cracked at the base, its inscription partially obscured by mud. Nathaniel did not read the name. Some instinct older than fear told him not to. His chest tightened, not with pain but with pressure, a borrowed weight. The same strange constriction he had felt the first day, now magnified, lingering longer. It was as if another man's final breath still echoed in his lungs. He staggered back, nearly slipping on the loose soil, and leaned heavily on the cane. The moment he did, the pressure eased. Relief flooded him again, too complete, too perfect. Understanding struck with sickening clarity. The cane was not guiding him randomly. It was leading him to places where suffering slept. He did not walk home. He limped, half-dazed, clinging to alley shadows and empty streets until the familiar outline of his house emerged from the darkness. By the time he reached his door, dawn was beginning to pale the sky. No one saw him, or if they did, no one stopped him. Inside, he collapsed into the kitchen chair and shook until the coffee finished brewing. That morning, he opened his journal and wrote everything. The cemetery, the pit, the heat of the handle. When he finished, his hands were steady, his breathing calm. A surgeon's composure had returned, not because he felt safe, but because he finally understood the nature of the problem. His grandfather had not been curing illness. He had been collecting it. Each night the cane sought out pain, terminal pain, buried pain, forgotten pain, and transferred it. The body in the ground was relieved. The ledger grew longer. Balance was maintained. And now the account was active again. Nathaniel locked the cane in his study cabinet that afternoon. He wrapped it in the same oilcloth it had arrived in and sealed the door with a length of rope, absurd and desperate. That night, he slept without it. The pain returned like a tidal wave. By midnight, he was drenched in sweat, every nerve screaming, his spine burning with familiar cruelty. He bit down on a towel to keep from crying out. The relief he had tasted made the suffering unbearable by comparison. At 2:17 a.m. he broke. He dragged himself to the study, hands shaking so violently he fumbled the knot twice. The moment the cane touched his skin, the pain vanished again, replaced by that borrowed tightness, that foreign echo. He wept openly then, not from pain, but from the knowledge of what he was choosing. The next morning, there were new marks on the silver. One fresh line, one new name still shallow as if hesitant. His own. With soil ground deep into the lines of his palm, his nails jammed full of damp earth. Worse than the mess was the sensation clinging to him, the unmistakable memory of straining against weight, of pulling at something that did not want to be moved, something anchored by death itself. He forced himself to look around. The ground nearby was scarred with deliberate openings, not chaos, not vandalism. Each section of earth had been opened with care, every hollow cut to the same measured depth, stopping precisely where wood would be waiting beneath. Whoever or whatever had done this worked with intention, with knowledge. Nathaniel staggered backward, his heel catching against a low marble marker. He glanced down, and his breath left him in a soundless rush. The name was carved in a style he recognized instantly. Eleanor Hartwell, born and died in the same year. His mind snapped back to the silver handle, to the tiny etched entry he had studied under glass. The initials, the year, consumption. This was not coincidence. This was confirmation. A child, an infant. The soil atop her grave was loose, freshly turned. Scratches marred the stone itself, short, frantic lines that mirrored the damage to his own fingers. His stomach twisted as understanding took shape. Whatever relief the cane granted the living, it demanded something from the dead. Panic finally broke through his discipline. He ran. Branches tore at his feet. Stones split the skin of his soles. He barely felt it. His back remained eerily painless, but his chest burned now with a different suffering, one born of certainty. This was not healing. It was theft. By the time he reached his house, morning light was crawling up the street. Blood streaked the floor as he crossed the threshold. The cane never left his hand. It radiated heat, almost eager. In his study, hands shaking, he raised the magnifying glass once more. The silver told the truth without mercy. Fresh lines, newly cut letters, more names added to a ledger that should have ended generations ago. The phone rang. The sound shattered the silence. "Dad," Mitchell's voice was thin, exhausted. "I need to talk to you." Nathaniel stood frozen, staring at the cane. "What's wrong?" "It's Lucy," Mitchell said. "She's been doing strange things." Cold spread through Nathaniel's chest. "She's been walking in her sleep," Mitchell continued. "Catherine found her outside last week, barefoot. She didn't remember a thing. Her feet were cut up like she'd been wandering for hours." He hesitated, then added quietly, "And she keeps saying it's hard to breathe. Not pain exactly, pressure, like something heavy is pressing on her chest." Nathaniel's grip tightened until the silver bit into his skin. Tests, heart concerns, the same inherited weakness, the same fragile place his grandfather's records whispered about. The timeline aligned with brutal precision. The cane had not simply awakened. It had expanded its reach. Nathaniel closed his eyes, the weight of generations settling on him at last. This was the burden his grandfather had carried in silence, not the role of healer, but of keeper, of someone who decided where pain went and who was forced to bear the cost of that choice. And now, without knowing it, a child was being drawn into the cycle. When Nathaniel spoke again, his voice was steady, stripped of denial. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Do not let Lucy sleep alone tonight, and whatever you do, don't ignore this." As he hung up, the cane pulsed warmly in his hand, satisfied. For the first time since it arrived, Nathaniel did not feel relief. He felt responsibility. He didn't wait for the confirmation. He already knew. "About a week," Mitchell said quietly. "Same time the sleepwalking started." Then, softer, edged with worry, "Dad, you're holding something back. I can hear it." Nathaniel stared down at the object in his hands. The cane rested against his palm like a living thing, its metal still faintly warm, as if it remembered where it had been before dawn. Outside the window, life moved on in small, ordinary rituals, neighbors tying leashes, doors opening, newspapers thudding onto porches, a world untouched by what he now carried. "I think," he said carefully, "I need to come to Chicago." "What, you hate planes, and your back?" "My back is fine," Nathaniel cut in too sharply. He inhaled, steadied himself. "Better than fine. Listen to me. Whatever's happening to Lucy, it started when something changed for me. I can't explain it over the phone, but I need to see her. Today." Silence stretched between them. "You're frightening me," Mitchell finally said. "I know," Nathaniel replied. "Because I'm frightened too. Book the flight. I'll be there tonight." When the call ended, the house felt impossibly quiet. Only then did the full weight of the transformation settle on him. 7 days ago, he had been a retired physician managing pain and routine. Now he was waking in cemeteries, touching graves he didn't remember digging, and somehow, impossibly, linked to his granddaughter's failing breath. His training rebelled against the thought. Patterns were not proof. Fear distorted perception. But another voice spoke louder, the voice shaped by a childhood spent under Silas Crane's roof, where medicine had never been purely clinical, and questions were often answered with silence instead of facts. Nathaniel spent the day chasing ghosts through archives and forgotten records. Official histories told him almost nothing, but buried in obscure journals and private correspondence, another image of his grandfather emerged. Letters exchanged with European physicians exploring something they called the relocation of suffering. Notes hinting at ailments being shifted rather than cured. Pain treated like matter, movable, transferable. One document made his hands tremble. A letter written 2 years before Silas's death. In it, his grandfather described extraordinary success using receptive vessels to absorb afflictions others could not bear. He wrote that the newly dead were ideal, silent, stable, compliant. Then, almost as an aside, he suggested the living might serve as containers as well, under the right conditions. Nathaniel leaned back, heart pounding. The cane was never meant to heal permanently. It was a conduit. Silas Crane had not eliminated suffering. He had redistributed it, stored it, cataloged it. And when death took him, the instrument of that terrible balance had simply waited, patient, preserved, until another Crane was desperate enough to pick it up. By late afternoon, the truth was unavoidable. The pain removed from Nathaniel's body hadn't vanished. It had been displaced. And now, with the ledger growing fuller, the system was searching for new places to put its weight. Places that were still breathing. As evening approached and his flight time neared, Nathaniel wrapped the cane carefully and placed it in his bag. He understood now what his grandfather had become. Not a healer, not a monster, but something trapped between obligation and obsession. And unless he acted quickly, the next generation would pay the price for his relief. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became. Silas Crane had not merely practiced unconventional medicine. He had crossed a line most physicians refused to acknowledge even existed. He treated illness as something transferable, a weight that could be lifted from one body and quietly placed into another. The walking cane, etched with names, dates, and diagnoses, was not a keepsake. It was the mechanism, a ledger and a lever combined. And somehow, after decades of dormancy, it had begun working again. Nathaniel packed in silence, clothes folded with mechanical precision, documents slid into folders. At the last moment, he hesitated with the cane in his hands. Leaving it behind felt unthinkable. Even imagining the separation sent a ghost of pain flaring through his spine, sharp enough to steal his breath. Whatever curse or covenant this was, it had already claimed him. He placed the cane carefully into his carry-on and closed the zipper. The airport was loud, impersonal, alive. While waiting to board, Nathaniel stepped aside and made one final call. Frank Kelly answered on the second ring. "Dr. Crane," the groundskeeper said, voice tight. "I was expecting you." Nathaniel swallowed. "Why that?" "Because someone's been tampering with the graves," Kelly replied. "Started about a week ago. Always the old plots, 1930s mostly. Whoever it is knows exactly where to dig. Never sloppy, never deep enough to be noticed right away." A chill crept up Nathaniel's neck. "You think you know who?" "Tommy Flynn used to," Kelly said slowly. "The keeper before me. He told stories about your grandfather. Said Silas Crane came here often. Walked the rows with that cane of his. Always the newer graves. Folks who passed sudden." Nathaniel's grip tightened around his phone. Kelly hesitated, then added almost reluctantly, "Since this started, I've been dreaming. Same dream over and over. A tall man with a walking stick moving through the cemetery at night. And the dead, well, they're not sleeping easy." The line went dead. Nathaniel stood frozen in the terminal as the announcement for boarding echoed overhead. The cane inside his bag radiated warmth, insistent, impatient. Whatever awaited him in Chicago, he understood now that this story was far older and far darker than his own pain. The flight itself was its own kind of torment. Not physical. His back remained miraculously free of agony, but something deeper. Each pocket of turbulence sent a strange tremor through his chest, like a borrowed heartbeat stumbling out of rhythm. For brief moments, his lungs tightened as if the air he inhaled had already been used by someone else. He closed his eyes and saw graves, names, dates, children who never reached adulthood, adults who vanished without warning. A catalog of suffering balanced neatly across decades, now tipping out of control. By the time the plane touched down, Nathaniel understood the truth he had been avoiding. The cane didn't just take pain, it redistributed it. And now, with too many debts unpaid and too many names newly carved, the burden was spilling outward, into the living, into the innocent, into his granddaughter. As he stepped into the jetway, the weight of inheritance settled fully onto his shoulders. Not wealth, not legacy. Responsibility. Sela's crane had passed the instrument down, believing someone in the family would be strong enough to carry it. Nathaniel now knew the cost of that strength. And unless he found a way to end the cycle, Lucy would become just another name waiting for silver. He felt as if the air itself resisted his breathing, thick with the echo of someone else's final moments. He had tried once to leave the cane behind, to step into the world without it, but the punishment had been immediate. His spine had ignited with savage intensity, a reminder carved straight into nerve and bone. Worse still, his left hand had begun to twitch on its own, fingers flexing and scraping at nothing. Rehearsing motions learned in soil and darkness. Mitchell was waiting at the terminal. One glance was enough to unsettle Nathaniel. His son looked hollowed out, the easy strength of him worn thin by sleepless nights and quiet dread. "How is she?" Nathaniel asked as they walked. Mitchell exhaled shakily. "Not good. The tests confirmed it. Her heart condition is accelerating, faster than anyone expected." He swallowed. "They're talking about surgery." Nathaniel stopped walking. "She's only 8. "I know," Mitchell's voice cracked, "and that's not all." They reached the car. Mitchell unlocked it, hands unsteady, then sat without starting the engine. "She talks in her sleep," he said. "About you, about a man with a walking stick who comes into her room at night." The world seemed to tilt. "She describes him exactly," Mitchell continued. "Your height, your hair, your voice." Nathaniel's stomach dropped. "That's impossible. I've been states away." "I know," Mitchell said quietly. "That's what scares me." He finally turned the key, but the engine idled while the question he'd been holding back rose to the surface. "Dad, is there something about that cane you're not telling me?" Nathaniel stared out at the airport traffic, people rushing toward ordinary lives, unaware of how fragile normal really was. He thought of silver warmed by stolen pain, of names carved too neatly to be coincidence, of a child sleeping with someone else's burden pressing against her chest. "I think," he said slowly, "that my grandfather crossed lines he never should have, and that cane isn't an heirloom, it's an instrument." Mitchell looked at him, stunned. "An instrument for what?" "For moving suffering," Nathaniel said, "from one body to another." The drive into the city passed in heavy silence. Familiar streets blurred by, coffee shops, playgrounds, families moving through lives that still made sense. Nathaniel felt as though he were watching it all from behind glass. The house in Lincoln Park stood exactly as he remembered. Warm brick, white trim, a place meant to be safe. As they stepped inside, Nathaniel felt the cane thrum softly, almost eagerly. And upstairs, behind a closed bedroom door, a child slept, already being taught the terrible lesson his grandfather had perfected long ago. That pain never disappears. It only changes hands. His arm tightened. Nathaniel's voice was steady, but the weight of the truth pressed down like a physical force. The cane, it's not just a walking stick. It's a conduit. My grandfather didn't just heal people. He transferred ailments from one body to another, and somehow it's active again. Mitchell's eyes went wide, a mixture of disbelief and horror. You're saying my daughter? Nathaniel nodded slowly, his hands trembling despite the warmth of the cane in his lap. Her sleepwalking, the dreams, the names she's been speaking, they're connected. The same graves I visited, the same names etched into the silver handle. The cane channels more than just pain, it moves it. And now Lucy is receiving it. Catherine clutched her hands to her chest, her voice trembling. So all this time, all these nights she's been lying there, she's been living through what the cane dictates, Nathaniel finished for her. In a way she doesn't even understand. I thought it was just me, but it's not. Whatever Sela's crane started, it's still working, and she's caught in it now. Mitchell ran a hand through his hair, packing. How do we stop it? How do we protect her? Nathaniel shook his head. I don't know if we can, not fully. The cane's influence is ancient, precise, and it responds to its own logic. But I think there's a way to guide it, to at least minimize the damage. He lifted the cane from the bag, its silver handle glowing faintly under the living room lights. I need you to trust me. Whatever happens tonight, whatever you hear or see, understand that the cane's power is real, and we're going to confront it, together. A tense silence fell over the room. The normal hum of suburban life outside felt distant, irrelevant. The air inside the house was thick, charged, waiting. Lucy stirred in her sleep upstairs, murmuring words that no child should ever know, speaking of names, dates, and places long buried. Nathaniel's eyes met Mitchell's. We have to follow her tonight. We have to see where it leads. If we can intercept it before it completes its cycle, we might save her. Catherine's voice was barely audible, a whisper of fear and hope. And if we can't? Nathaniel held the cane tightly. Then we prepare for what comes next. But first, we must understand it. Tonight, we learn the truth about Sela's crane's legacy and face the darkness he left behind. The room seemed to pulse with anticipation, and somewhere deep within Nathaniel, a primal fear stirred. Not for himself, not for the pain that had once consumed him, but for the little girl upstairs, whose life was now entangled in the same web of shadows his grandfather had woven nearly a century ago. Outside, the night waited, quiet but full of promise and menace. The journey had begun. Catherine's fingers clenched around Mitchell's, her knuckles whitening as the truth settled deeper into the room. The cane rested on the coffee table like a silent judge, its polished surface catching the lamplight in a way that felt unsettlingly deliberate. For a moment, all three of them simply stared at it, half expecting it to react, to move, to speak, to confess. The silver grip was warm again, not from the room, from them. So what you're telling me, Mitchell said at last, his voice low and strained, is that this thing doesn't just heal. It takes sickness and puts it somewhere else. Nathaniel nodded once, slowly, gravely. That's exactly what it does. He reached into his bag and pulled out a thick folder, its edges bent from hurried research. When he spread the papers across the table, they looked wildly out of place among family photos and coasters, medical diagrams, letters, yellowed translations filled with cramped handwriting. My grandfather wasn't just experimenting, Nathaniel continued. He was obsessed. During the Depression, when people were desperate, he went looking for answers medicine couldn't give. He believed illness was a burden, something that could be carried, passed on, displaced. Mitchell picked up one of the pages. The drawing showed two human figures connected by looping lines, arrows pointing from chest to chest, heart to heart. Symbols surrounded them like instructions from a ritual rather than a clinic. "This isn't medicine," Mitchell said quietly. "This is something else." "Yes," Nathaniel replied. "And this letter," he tapped a dated page, "confirms it. He writes that the transfer only works if the recipient can hold the burden. The dead were ideal. They couldn't resist. They couldn't suffer in ways the living could." Catherine turned away from the table and walked to the window, wrapping her arms around herself. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful, porch lights glowing, a jogger passing, a dog pulling at its leash. Ordinary life, untouched by the nightmare unfolding inside this house. "This can't be real," she said, her voice tight, brittle. "You're talking about rituals, about moving disease like a curse. There has to be a logical explanation." Nathaniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. "Then explain the timing," he said softly. "Explain why my pain vanished the same week Lucy began getting worse. Explain how an 8-year-old knows the names, dates, and burial places of people who died nearly 100 years ago." Catherine opened her mouth to respond, and froze. From upstairs, Lucy's voice drifted down the staircase. Clear, calm, too steady for a sick child. "Luke Morrison," she recited gently as if reading from memory. 8 years old, heart failure, 1934. Silence crashed down on the living room. Mitchell's breath hitched. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. Nathaniel closed his eyes, because that name was carved into the cane. And deep down, he knew what it meant. The transfer wasn't finished. "He says the hurt isn't stopping," Lucy murmured from upstairs, her voice calm and far too old for her small body. "It's moving, traveling through the wood, through the silver. He says you should tell the doctor it's almost time." The words floated down the staircase with unnatural clarity. The three adults didn't move. They couldn't. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't a child speaking in her sleep. The cadence was precise, clinical, delivered with the cold certainty of a diagnosis. Mitchell swallowed hard. What do we do?" Nathaniel reached for the cane. The moment his fingers closed around it, the warmth surged. No longer a gentle reassurance, but a pulse, urgent and demanding, like a heart racing toward failure. The wood seemed to vibrate faintly, as if it recognized what was coming. "We go back," Nathaniel said at last. "Back to Massachusetts, to the cemetery." Catherine turned sharply. "To do what?" "To finish it," he replied. "To put back what was taken, to make sure this ends with me." The words tasted like a verdict. He looked at his son and daughter-in-law, seeing fear mirror fear, dread reflected endlessly between them. "This thing didn't just heal me," he continued. "It's been storing pain, 8 decades of it. Every illness my grandfather moved, every life he touched. It's been waiting, building toward something final." "And you think that something is now?" Mitchell asked. Nathaniel nodded. "Lucy isn't just suffering alongside it, she's central to it. She shares the same heart condition mine, Silas's is. The cane wants her, a perfect vessel, young, alive, strong enough to hold what it's been carrying." Catherine's breath caught. "So what, you're offering yourself instead?" "I'm ending the line," Nathaniel said quietly. "If I don't, it won't stop with her. It will move on, another bearer, another family. This ends with me. Mitchell's voice broke. Dad, if you do this, you could die. Nathaniel met his gaze without flinching. If I don't, Lucy will, and the cycle continues. For a moment, the house was utterly still. Then Catherine turned from the window, her expression set with a resolve sharper than fear. Then we're coming with you. No, Nathaniel said immediately. Lucy is too weak, traveling. She's getting worse here, Catherine cut in. Whatever's happening to her is tied to that thing. She pointed at the cane without looking at it. If this is the end of it, if there's a final moment, then she needs to be there when it happens. Mitchell stood, decision settling over him like armor. We leave at dawn. I'll arrange a medical flight. She can't handle commercial travel, but there are services equipped for this. Nathaniel hesitated. Once we go down this road, there's no undoing it. Mitchell's voice was steady, but his eyes were not. There hasn't been a way back since the moment you picked it up. We're already part of it. The only choice left is whether we let it consume us, or we face it head on. From upstairs, a soft sound drifted down. A cough, thin and strained, followed by a whisper not meant for any living ear. He's waiting, the voice said gently. And in Nathaniel's hand, the cane grew hot. Lucy's voice floated down the stairs once more, but now it had changed. It was smaller, trembling, frightened in a way that belonged to a child, not a messenger. Grandpa, she called softly, are you coming to get me? Catherine rushed toward the stairs, but Nathaniel froze, every muscle locked. The man with the walking stick says you're coming to get me, Lucy continued, her words breaking. But I don't want to go. I want to stay with Mommy and Daddy. The silence that followed was unbearable. Mitchell, Catherine, and Nathaniel looked at one another, and in that instant Nathaniel understood something with painful clarity. Whatever waited for them in Massachusetts, it would not be faced alone. The cane had splintered their family across 3 generations, secrets, suffering, silence. But now, at the very end, it had bound them together with purpose. Pack light, Nathaniel said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. We leave at dawn. Chapter 6, The Return. They were airborne the next morning. Lucy was bundled in blankets, her small body secured in a wheelchair, oxygen hissing softly beside her. Overnight, she had worsened. Nathaniel saw it immediately, the shallow breathing, the ashen tint to her skin. He had seen this progression countless times in hospitals. Heart failure advancing far faster than nature allowed. Catherine had begged to take Lucy to the ER. Nathaniel had stopped her, not out of denial, but certainty. Whatever was killing, Lucy wasn't something a cardiologist or a machine could touch. The cane was the source, and only by confronting it could they hope to save her. From Logan Airport, Mitchell rented a car, and they drove west through the Massachusetts countryside in strained silence. The trees stood bare and watchful, branches clawing at the gray sky. Lucy slept fitfully in the back seat, murmuring in fevered half-dreams. Names, dates, diagnoses. Each one struck Nathaniel like a hammer. Luke Morrison doesn't hurt anymore, Lucy said suddenly, her eyes still closed, her voice unnervingly clear. He says someone else is holding it now. He says tell the doctor thank you. Nathaniel tightened his grip on the cane. The silver handle throbbed warmly in his palm, alive in a way it had never been before. It was responding to her, drawing closer to completion, to its final exchange. They reached Mount Auburn Cemetery just after noon. The place was quiet, dignified, ancient. Stones leaned like tired men, paths winding through generations of memory and loss. They parked near the main entrance. Frank Kelly stood waiting, as if he had known. "Dr. Crane," Frank said calmly, approaching the car. "I had a feeling you'd be back." Nathaniel nodded, helping Lucy from the back seat. She was awake now, her fever-bright eyes scanning the grounds with unsettling recognition. "I know this place," she whispered. "I've been here before." Catherine dropped to her knees beside her. "No, sweetheart, you've never been to Boston." Lucy shook her head weakly. "I have, at night, with the man with the walking stick." Nathaniel felt the cane grow warmer. And somewhere deep beneath the cemetery soil, something long buried stirred, aware that the final reckoning had begun. "Grandpa," Lucy's voice trembled as she lifted her eyes to Nathaniel. "You're the one who comes to me at night. You're the man in my dreams." The caretaker's face hardened as if an old truth had finally clawed its way into daylight. "She's telling the truth," he said quietly. "I've seen you out here after dark, always walking the same path, always toward the oldest graves, always with that stick in your hand. You're searching for something, aren't you?" Nathaniel swallowed. The air felt heavier, as though the cemetery itself were listening. "I'm trying to put an end to it," he said. "What my grandfather began here, it was never meant to last this long." The caretaker let out a bitter breath. "Your grandfather wasn't some misunderstood genius. He was cruel. I've spent most of my life thinking about what I was told as a boy, and I dug deeper once I had the courage. He didn't just heal people. He collected their suffering, turned pain into currency. That's how he built everything he had." Nathaniel's grip tightened. "And now the cane wants to finish what he started. It's trying to lock Lucy's illness into me forever." Silence stretched between them. "So how do you stop something like that?" the caretaker asked. Nathaniel looked down at the polished wood and silver in his hands, then back at Lucy's ghost-pale face. "By giving it what it's truly been waiting for. Not her pain, but the origin of all of this. The man who designed the ritual in the first place. But he's been dead for decades." "His body is," Nathaniel replied. "His work is. This thing needs one final name, one last offering, and I know whose name it's been saving space for." They moved deeper into the cemetery as the light thinned and shadows stretched across the ground. Lucy leaned heavily against her father, every step costing her effort. Nathaniel walked ahead, and with each step, the cane seemed to guide him, tugging him toward a forgotten corner where time had eroded both stone and memory. "There," Lucy said suddenly, lifting a trembling finger. "That one." The headstone was nearly swallowed by grass and ivy, its surface scarred by decades of rain and frost. The inscription was faint but unmistakable. "Silas Crane, 1880, 1942. Physician." "Physician," Catherine muttered under her breath. "That's generous." Nathaniel lowered himself to the ground and pressed his palm against the cold granite. The reaction was instant. The cane shuddered violently, heat flooding the silver grip as if something inside had awakened. Letters etched into the metal flared to life, glowing softly, one name after another, as though rising from beneath the surface. Lucy gasped, "I can see them." Nathaniel's heart skipped. "See who?" "All of them," she whispered. "Everyone he hurt, they're here. They've been waiting." His breath caught. Waiting for what? Lucy's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. "Most of them are children. Some are grown-ups. But they're all watching you, Grandpa. They want you to do something." "What do they want?" he asked, barely able to speak. "They want you to finish it," she said. "They want you to take the pain away for good." In that moment, Nathaniel finally understood what the cane had been shaping itself toward all these years, and what it would demand before it ever let them go. The torment had moved beyond anything the human mind was built to endure. Every sickness the cane had ever carried awakened inside Nathaniel at once, colliding and overlapping until pain itself lost meaning. And yet, beneath the agony, something unexpected settled in his chest. Calm, certainty, a quiet rightness. For the first time, the suffering wasn't being stolen or hidden. It was being owned, a debt finally paid. "It's happening," Lucy whispered, softening her voice. "They're not trapped anymore, they're going home." Nathaniel's heart convulsed violently, fighting against a crushing failure that wasn't born in his body. His lungs flooded as if he were drowning in a memory that wasn't his. Sharp, spreading sickness tore through his organs, diseases that had waited decades for a place to finish their story. Bones weakened, joints burned, flesh rebelled. Still, his hands never loosened. The cane scorched his palms now, no longer warm but viciously hot, as if forged in judgment itself. One by one, the engraved names faded away. Each disappearance was final. Each pain had found its last resting place. "Dad, please," Mitchell sobbed. "This can't be the only answer." Nathaniel barely managed a breath. It always was. He designed it this way. It was never healing, it was hoarding, waiting for someone in the family to stop running. Catherine checked Lucy again, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Her heart is stabilizing. Her breathing, it's clear. She's getting better." "Because it's all coming to me," Nathaniel whispered. "Every stolen moment, every life he cut short." The cane's vibration climbed toward something absolute. Nathaniel felt himself thinning, unraveling, but with it came an overwhelming sense of completion. A balance settling back into place. The dead released, the living unburdened. "I see him," Lucy said suddenly, pointing toward the grave. "Your grandfather." A tall, shadowed figure stood beside the headstone, rigid with fury. His eyes burned with cold intelligence, his presence heavy with defiance. "He's angry," Lucy said. "He wants it to continue. He says this was his purpose." Nathaniel forced his eyes open, his strength fading fast. "No," he breathed. "It was his curse." The cane pulsed one final time in his hands. "And it ends here." The shape that rose from the grave drew closer, its outline sharpening with every step. Nathaniel recognized the bloodline instantly. The narrow face, the precise hands, the eyes trained to diagnose and dissect. Hands that had once promised healing and instead etched agony into metal. Yet behind the fury burning in those eyes, something else trembled. Doubt, disbelief, a fracture in the certainty that had driven him. "You're a fool," the apparition hissed, its voice brittle and dry like leaves dragged across stone. "You're tearing down everything I created. That instrument could have made our name immortal. We could have cured the incurable." "By robbing others of their lives," Nathaniel whispered, his strength thinning. "By building comfort from stolen suffering." "I save people," the spirit snapped back. Its form flickered, briefly unstable. "Do you know what it's like to watch children fade while you stand useless? To face death daily with nothing but crude tools and false hope?" For an instant, the fury cracked. Beneath it stood a man drowning in failure and fear. "She was the first," Silas continued, his voice quieter now. "A baby wasting away. Her mother begged me. I couldn't let her die, so I found a way." "And it never ended," Nathaniel said, the truth settling heavily. "One life demanded another." Silas's gaze fell. Every cure required a vessel. The cane learned hunger. It began choosing from me. His form hardened again, anger flooding back. But the living mattered more than the dead. You decided who deserved peace, Nathaniel said. That wasn't medicine, that was tyranny. Silas recoiled, guilt flashing across his face like lightning. And you would end it all, let everything vanish with you. He reached for the cane, but his translucent fingers slipped through it, powerless. You can't stop this, he snarled. It will pass on, it always does. No, Lucy said softly. She stepped forward before anyone could stop her, resting her small hand against the cane beside Nathaniel's blistered grip. The artifact shuddered, not violently but deliberately. Its frantic energy softened, steady. I can feel them, Lucy said, her voice calm and certain. They aren't trapped anymore. They're at peace. Lucy stopped, Catherine cried. But Mitchell held her back, his eyes wide with awe. She's okay, he said. She's not hurting. They're telling me, Lucy continued, closing her eyes. They don't want this to continue. They don't want anyone else chosen. The shadow of Silas Crane staggered, his form thinning, unraveling. The certainty that had fueled him for decades collapsed under the weight of truth he could no longer deny. The cane pulsed once slow, final. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was free. Her voice rose, steady and unwavering, cutting through the chill of the cemetery night. The cane's power isn't eternal, she said softly. It ends when someone chooses love over pain. The shadow of Silas Crane trembled, a flicker of disbelief in his ghostly eyes. Impossible, he hissed. The power is ours, inseparable from our bloodline. Not if someone innocent wills it, Lucy said. Her fingers pressed lightly against the cane and she began to speak. Not the names etched in silver, but names of the living. Friends, teachers, parents, those who had shown her kindness, those whose care had shaped her world. With every name, the cane shivered, its vibration slowing, the searing heat in Nathaniel's hands softening to a comforting warmth. The illnesses that had ravaged him began to ebb, restrained by something greater than curses or magic, a force of genuine love and remembrance. I choose to remember the goodness, Lucy said clearly. I choose to see the people beyond their pain. The spirit of Silas Crane let out a tortured wail that shook the surrounding gravestones. This cannot be how it ends. It is how it must, Nathaniel replied, his voice steady, carrying the weight of forgiveness and the calm strength of someone who had faced suffering and chosen healing. The cane groaned in protest, tiny cracks tracing along its polished wood. The silver handle, once white-hot and punishing, now radiated a gentle warmth, like a hand offering solace. The names carved along its surface shimmered briefly, then softened into peaceful relief, as if the souls themselves were finally being allowed to rest. It's working, Frank Kelly breathed, stepping closer from the shadows. He had lingered at a distance, but now he could see the change, the centuries of pain dissolving into quiet light. The form of Silas Crane wavered, his shape less solid, edges dissolving like smoke caught in a breeze. I will not be undone, the phantom cried, surging forward, intent on reclaiming the cane. Lucy planted herself firmly between Nathaniel and the spirit. Her small frame glowed with an inner radiance, pure and unwavering. When Silas's shadow reached her, it recoiled as if struck by fire. You have no power here, she said, her tone calm but unyielding. Not anymore. The apparition froze, staring at her. Confusion, recognition, maybe awe, emotions the living world had never granted him, flickered in those ancient eyes. He had never encountered such force, selfless, fearless love. How, he whispered, his voice stripped of menace, how can you forgive what I've done? Lucy's hand remained on the cane, steady and warm. Because holding on to hate only spreads more suffering, she said. And this is enough, no more. The spirit's form began to dissolve, turning translucent, drifting toward nothingness. Before he vanished entirely, a final breath of sound left his lips, a whisper that carried through the clearing. Something shifted in Silas Crane's expression. The fury, the arrogance that had clung to him like a second skin for decades, softened, replaced by a flicker of something like regret. I thought I was helping, the spirit whispered, fragile now, almost human. I thought I was saving people from pain. You were, Lucy said gently, her voice steady, filled with clarity beyond her years. But some pain is meant to be shared, not stolen. With those words, the ghost dissolved completely, leaving only a faint trace of carbolic bitterness and the lingering weight of old mistakes. The cane cracked audibly, splitting down its length with a sharp, brittle sound that echoed across the cemetery like breaking bones. The sicknesses that had clawed through Nathaniel's body began to unravel, fatting, not passing to anyone else, but released back into the world where they belonged. The natural order was restoring itself, and the curse that had haunted 3 generations of his family finally lifted. The names are gone, Mitchell said quietly, inspecting the fractured cane. The silver handle is smooth now. Because the debts have been repaid, Frank Kelly said, stepping closer. The dead can rest, and the living we can heal. Nathaniel rose slowly, leaning on Mitchell for support. He felt weak, drained by the ordeal, but a strange clarity filled him. The chronic pain in his back was back, yes, but it felt manageable, part of a human life rather than a supernatural punishment. How do you feel? Catherine asked, her hands gentle on his arm, checking his pulse. Like myself again, he said, voice quiet but steady. For the first time in weeks, I feel like me. Lucy examined the broken cane, her young face thoughtful. They're not angry anymore, she said softly. The people who were hurt, they're grateful that someone finally listened. What happens now? Mitchell asked. Nathaniel's eyes drifted to the horizon, sunlight painting the autumn leaves in gold. Now, we go home, he said. We remember that real healing comes from love, not by taking someone else's pain. They buried the fractured cane in Silas Crane's grave, covering the pieces with earth and fallen leaves. As they walked back to the car, Nathaniel felt the weight of family history settle on his shoulders, not as a burden this time, but as a promise. To do better, to live better than those who came before. 6 months later, Nathaniel sat in his Brooklyn study, speaking into a small recording device. The manuscript he was compiling would never see publication. Some truths were too dangerous to release to the world, yet he felt compelled to record what had happened. His family deserved to know the cost of ambition, the toll of unchecked obsession. His back pain was stable now, managed with medication and careful therapy. He had returned part-time to Massachusetts General, guiding young doctors and teaching them the importance of ethics as much as skill. Lucy had recovered fully, her heart strong and steady. She visited Boston often, and the bond between grandfather and granddaughter had deepened into something unbreakable, forged through shared trials that no ordinary family could comprehend. Nathaniel reflected aloud into the recorder. The cane, its power, was never truly supernatural. It fed on guilt, on suffering stored in memory and fear. When that weight was acknowledged, when it was faced with love and courage, its grip evaporated. He paused, watching the autumn leaves fall outside his window. Seasons had turned. Life had circled back, to something resembling peace. I think of my grandfather sometimes, Nathaniel continued, voice calm. Not with anger, but with pity. A man so focused on eliminating suffering that he forgot suffering is part of being human. In trying to cheat pain, he created something far worse. The phone rang, pulling him from his reverie. Mitchell's voice came through, warm and excited. Dad, I just got Lucy's latest checkup results. Her heart function is perfect. No trace of the defect that haunted our family for generations. Nathaniel smiled, a quiet, deep smile. That's wonderful news, he said. She's been dreaming again, Mitchell continued. But now the dreams are different. She dreams of the people from the cemetery, but they're happy, at peace. They're finally free. I'm glad to hear that, Nathaniel said softly. Dad, do you ever regret it? Do you wish you kept the cane? Nathaniel considered, the weight of months of suffering, of loss, and of redemption pressing in. His retirement was quiet, sometimes lonely. But when he thought of Lucy's laughter, her bright eyes, the peace they had all finally found, the answer became clear. No, he said finally, steady and resolute. I don't regret it. Some prices are worth paying. After hanging up the phone, Nathaniel returned to his study, the recorder clicking softly as he resumed dictation. There was still more to capture, more truths to preserve for the generations yet to come. But as he spoke, a weight lifted from his chest, something he hadn't felt in decades. A story that had begun in shadows and pain was finally complete. The cane was gone, shattered into harmless fragments, but its lessons lingered. Power forged through the suffering of others was hollow at its core. True healing came not from stealing or transferring pain, but from bearing it together, from sharing the burden, from choosing love over fear. It was a lesson that had taken 3 generations to understand, but perhaps that was the way life intended it. Some wisdom can only be earned through experience. Some redemption comes only through sacrifice. Outside his window, autumn leaves drifted lazily to the ground, each one a tiny death nurturing the promise of spring. Life, death, suffering, healing. They moved in an endless cycle as they always had. But now, for the first time in nearly a century, the Crane family was part of that natural rhythm instead of trying to bend it to their will. In that acceptance, Nathaniel found a peace no artifact, no matter how powerful, could ever grant. A year later, Nathaniel returned to Mount Auburn Cemetery with Lucy and Mitchell. They carried a small memorial stone, placed carefully near Silas Crane's grave, not to glorify the man, but to honor those who had suffered because of him. The inscription was simple, in memory of those who suffered so that others might learn the true meaning of healing. Lucy set a bouquet of flowers beside the stone, her young face solemn yet serene. Do you think they know we remember them? She asked softly. I think they do, Nathaniel said, letting the sun's warm afternoon light fall across the cemetery. I think they've finally found the peace they were denied in life. Frank Kelly approached, his weathered features softened by something like satisfaction. It's quiet now, he said. No more disturbed graves, no more midnight visitors, just the rest the dead deserve. Good, Nathaniel replied simply. That's how it should be. As they walked back toward their car, Lucy slipped her hand into her grandfather. Grandpa, do you think other families have secrets like ours? Nathaniel considered the question. Throughout his career, he had seen mysteries that defied explanation, patterns of illness and recovery that seemed to follow rules only those within the family could know. Often, the supernatural was merely the natural world unfolding in ways science had yet to comprehend. Probably, he said finally. But that's why we tell stories, Lucy. so others can learn from the mistakes of those who came before, so the same tragedies don't have to be repeated. Will you tell my story someday? She asked after a moment of thought. I think I'd like that, she admitted. Not for fame, but so maybe it can help someone understand that some powers aren't worth having. Nathaniel squeezed her hand gently. Exactly. That's why stories must be told. They drove home through the rolling Massachusetts countryside, 3 generations finally unburdened by the weight of the past. The cane was gone, its power broken, its victims at rest. But the lessons it had imparted, the true nature of healing, the price of power, the redemptive force of love, would linger long after its echoes faded from the world. In the end, that was the greatest healing of all, transforming a family curse into a story of redemption, turning suffering into wisdom, fear into love. The walnut walking cane had taken nearly a century to complete its work, and in the process, it had done something Silas Crane never intended. It had taught his descendants that true healing comes not from eliminating pain, but from facing it together. And in that courage, the Crane family finally found the peace that had eluded them for 3 generations.